The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Britain just got its 5th Prime Minister since the 2016 Brexit vote. It's had 3 in barely 2 months. Does it suggest that democracy in the United Kingdom is in trouble or working just as it should? We'll look into what's afoot tonight. Then, Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz is with us on the prospect of reforming the global economy and what he calls a progressive capitalism. It's Thursday, November 3rd, and that's tonight on The Agenda. It's tempting to assume that the rather astonishing turnover in the office of the British Prime Minister this year is due somehow to a flawed cast of characters in and around the ruling Conservative Party. But amid the post-Brexit economic turmoil there, to say nothing of the ripple effects of the pandemic, perhaps there is more to the story than first meets the eye. Let's get a read on number 10 Downing Street and beyond, starting in London, UK, with Anoush Chakalian, Britain editor of The New Statesman, and Andrew McDougall, director at Trafalgar Strategy and a former director of communications in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office. In Oxford, UK, Ben Ansell, professor of comparative democratic institutions at the University of Oxford. And in Edinburgh, Scotland, Ailsa Henderson, professor of political science at the University of Edinburgh. And it's great to have you four on our program tonight to review what have been some just virtually unprecedented times in the motherland. Ben, let's get you going first on this. Liz Truss one day is meeting with the Queen, and then not that long after, she's out. For those who haven't followed the story carefully here, how did that happen?
Well, she just lasted over 40 days. So if you only last just over 40 days, you've clearly had a lot of things go wrong. And I can only touch on a few here, and I'm sure everybody else will chip in. But I think the first problem was that fundamentally the way that Liz Truss appeared on the scene was by being elected by the Conservative Party membership. And that membership isn't a lot like the rest of the country in the sense it's a lot richer, it's a lot older, it's a lot whiter, and it really, really likes tax cuts. And so she was able to win that membership vote over Rishi Sunak, who of course we'll return to, by promising tax cuts. And Rishi Sunak played the Cassandra, saying we can't have tax cuts, interest rates will rise, there'll be an economic crisis, and nobody wanted to hear that. And so at the beginning, there's just a mismatch between what the Conservative Party membership won and maybe what the British public wanted, and also what economic markets wanted. The second problem then was when Liz Truss got into government, she carried on in the same way. So then there was a misreading of the markets. And she thought, well, the markets are full of rich traders who will want tax cuts, and I'm sure they do like tax cuts. But what they really hate is high interest rates. And they got spooked by a series of tax promises in what was called the mini budget, and then a set of promises straight after that. And so interest rates shot up in the following week. And ultimately, that's what did first for Liz Truss's Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, that's her finance minister, and then for Liz Truss herself. The final thing I would say, there was this mismatch and then this misreading, but Liz Truss also fundamentally misunderstood her own power within the Conservative Party. She had an 80-seat majority that Boris Johnson won in 2019, but she thought that would keep her safe from challenge, and so she stacked her cabinet with her own supporters. Almost nobody who supported her rival, Rishi Sunak, made it into the cabinet. And she felt that this parliamentary majority would keep her safe. But of course, all you have to worry about when you have an 80-seat majority is your own colleagues, not the opposition. And it was her own colleagues that ultimately did for her.
Anoush, maybe you can pick up on that in as much as I'm sure our viewers remember this very dignified picture of Liz Truss with the Queen's last official duty. It was a good moment. Then the Queen died, and Liz Truss gave what was widely perceived to be a pretty good speech memorializing the Queen. And then it just fell apart so quickly. How shocked were you that that happened that way?
I think it was much faster than any of us who have been covering it would have expected. And it was, faster than they expected, than all MPs really thought would happen. And in fact, it happened faster than perhaps even some of her critics wanted it to, because they wanted time to try and shore up, a potential successor. But really, it was absolute chaos. And I think one of the reasons that made it spiral so quickly was this mismatch, this disconnect that Ben mentioned between Liz Truss and, her troops. the MPs on the backbenches. There was a vote on fracking, which she was forcing them to vote with the government on, and many of them represent areas of the UK where they don't want fracking licenses. And so that was actually the thing that really the straw that broke the camel's back and made it all fall apart in the end, because you had these very unedifying scenes in the House of Commons where government officials called whips were trying to get MPs to vote along government lines on this. So you saw that disconnect between her and her MPs there. But something I would add as well, which led to the markets being spooked and also led to her party not understanding sort of the direction she was taking, was that she tried to force through her economic agenda without the sort of checks and balances that you'd usually have in place when delivering a budget. So they sacked the top official at the Treasury who, you need that person on site to try and deliver something like this. And they also didn't allow the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which usually does the sums and, sees whether the government's plans add up. They didn't let them scrutinise the plans either. And I think those two decisions were really something that broke from the norm and actually scared the establishment. And so that was something also that I think led to the very rapid undoing of her government.
Andrew, I think you've got to go back to the 1890s in Canada after the death of Sir John A. Macdonald to find a time when we went through a series of prime ministers so quickly, so many in such a short space of time. Again, as you looked at the events of the last few weeks in the United Kingdom, how shocked have you been at the way it's gone down?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be shocked, Steve, because it is unprecedented. And, when you look back, it all seems so obvious, as the other panelists have noted. It was Rishi Sunak that was running around in the summer going, Liz Truss's plans absolutely will not fly with the markets. We shouldn't do it. And so it came to pass. We did know in the first stage of the leadership, where she, at the support of fewer MPs than Rishi Sunak, that she would have a problem with her parliamentary party, as was noted. Again, obvious. And yeah, reality still matters. And that's the thing you look at when we fight reality as an ideologue or somebody who believes deeply in a political idea, in this case, kind of, a more libertarian, low tax environment. It still has to meet reality in a way that reality will let it pass. And the markets not having the checks and balances, as Anush mentioned, was absolutely right. All the signs were there. And so when you put that cocktail together, we shouldn't be surprised. And yeah, it probably did come too early, namely for Boris Johnson, who some suspect supported Liz Truss for this very reason, that she would live up to her nickname as the human hand grenade and explode, leaving him a path back. And that hasn't come to pass, because I think the parliamentary party has said, okay, we fought reality and lost. Let's back reality this time. Let's back Rishi Sunak and see if we can do better.
Yeah, Elsa, can you help us understand that? Because if, in fact, Boris Johnson was behind Liz Truss because he thought she'd flame out, and then the party would be crawling on its knees back to, begging Bojo to come back in, it sure didn't happen that way. How come?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons, but one of them is the personal popularity figures for Boris Johnson. He was while in office an unpopular figure, almost single-handedly responsible for what we've seen as a significant rise in support for independence in Scotland. He had problems of party management within his own party. He was perceived by people to be not on top of the details. And of course, his behavior throughout lockdowns and his role in concerns about whether the UK government was breaking its own lockdown rules had caused him personal problems that carried through when he attempted to stage a return. So all of this kind of caught up with him as he attempted to kind of swing in and solve the problems of the day.
Let me read you for an excerpt from The Economist from last year on the issue of whether or not this job, namely Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, is simply impossible nowadays. Here's the excerpt. British prime ministers have to perform a wider range of jobs than almost any other world leaders. They are heads of government, party bosses, fundraisers, parliamentary performers, foreign envoys, grief counselors, local MPs who can be ejected by their constituents. No prime minister can do all these jobs well, and all are bound to fail hopelessly at some. The weekly Prime Minister's questions, although not the only regular grilling a nation's leader faces, is almost certainly the world's most testing. Tony Blair described the ordeal as the most nerve-wracking, discombobulating, nail-biting, bowel-moving, terror-inspiring, courage-draining experience in my prime ministerial life. Let's get into some discussion on that. Anu, start us off on this. Is the job of British Prime Minister now, in a post-Brexit world, simply too tough?
It is a tough job, and I do agree with that analysis in that piece, but I don't think we should feel too sorry for British prime ministers. Look, power is really centralised in this country. It's concentrated around the individual who holds that post. But what they keep doing is trying to pull more and more power towards themselves and break down those pillars of accountability, that some of which we were touching on before. So we've had government clashes with the courts, most notably Boris Johnson trying to shut down Parliament to force Brexit through, and that particular decision was deemed illegal. We also have ministers breaking the ministerial code, which is this code of conduct, often which is a resigning offence. But the ultimate arbiter of the ministerial code is the Prime Minister. So if the Prime Minister deems that they shouldn't resign, then they don't resign. And then you also have independent ethics advisors. We've had 2 resign in 2 years. The post remains empty. And actually, the person who appoints that role is, surprise, surprise, the British Prime Minister. So you can see how accountability is being degraded. If there was very much accountability there in the first place, our system depends on a Prime Minister sort of being decent and agreeing to the checks and balances that are there by convention, rather than anything that's actually written down.
Andrew, that checklist could just as easily describe the Canadian Prime Minister's job. It's the same system of government, after all. When you were in the PMO for Stephen Harper, did you ever have moments where you thought, this job is too big for one person?
Well, no, and I would say that, of course, wouldn't I? But I think, and to add to that, the Canadian Prime Minister is expected to be in the House there's question period 5 days of the week, and Harper typically showed up for 3 of those, and it was a giant time suck. And this shows the importance of delegation and having people you trust. And I think what makes that more difficult in today's environment, Steve, is the 24/7 communications environment we live in now. There is no time to think or breathe. Everything moves at light speed. Everything that happens is put up on the web right away, whether that's an error at Prime Minister's questions. Usually the British public and the Canadian public wouldn't have seen that until the next day's newspaper or that night's broadcast. Now it's there for all to see the second it happens, forcing offices like the Prime Minister's office or number 10 Downing to respond in real time. And that takes up a lot of time and energy. And, one of the Sunday papers here had this expose of Liz Truss as foreign minister, and the amount of time and attention she had to put into her Instagram account alone. What are you doing, wasting your time with Instagram? You're the foreign minister of one of the UN Security Council permanent member countries. You should have more important things to do. And I think that's just a function of the environment, the communications, information environment we're in now. It's a cesspool, and politicians can't help but meddle and try to steer that cesspool because it dominates their agenda and their time.
Ben, can I get you on this? Is the job too big for one person now?
In the past, prime ministers have often had chancellors of the exchequer, so their finance minister, who are their rivals. And if you have a rival taking on half of the job, so Tony Blair had Gordon Brown, who then, of course, became prime minister, and they both had their own fiefdoms. And so I suppose to some extent that limited the amount Blair had to do. But I want to reiterate Anusha's point that if, as a prime minister, you spend a lot of time trying to get control from existing institutions and not a lot of time spent on trying to get your policy program right, which we're seeing right now with the Home Office being unable to get control over the channel crossings from migrant boats, you end up spending all of this effort trying to accumulate more and more power to do what with? And I think this is the trouble the Conservative Party have got themselves into, is they figured out how to win elections, they figured out how to denounce institutions, but they hadn't figured out how to turn that into a policy program that can last for them.
Ailsa, what would you add to that in terms of whether this job is just too much for one person these days?
Yeah, I think that's a Westminster conceit completely, this notion that the job for our head of government or the head of government in the UK is somehow harder than the job of any other head of government, particularly any other head of government in any other Westminster system is a bit difficult to take. The truth of it is that any head of government in the UK has, in a global sense, a fairly easy time of it. It's not a divided society, either ethnically or religiously. It's presiding over a time of peace. Democracy is not in peril. Economically, we were relatively prosperous until the government decided to prioritize national sovereignty over market access, as was its right. But I think if there are difficulties, a lot of them are of the government's own making. Separate from that, I would say one could make the case that it's slightly more difficult to be ahead of government if you are ahead of the Conservative Party, because of the divisions that we know exist within the Conservative Party, particularly the divisions over Brexit. So if we stick with this notion that some of these challenges are of our own making, and Brexit is one of them, then yes, I can well see that given the divisions within the Conservative Party, then it would be a difficult time for a Conservative Prime Minister. But I think in a global context, no, it's not the worst of the worst gigs you could have.
Andrew, could you follow up on that in terms of whether, now that the United Kingdom is no longer in the European Union, it's a harder job to be the UK Prime Minister, particularly because the economy has gotten worse because of Brexit?
Yeah, and this is the thing that nobody wants to mention, Steve, is that the country is fighting with basically one, if not two hands behind its back economically. And if Liz Truss was very serious about going for growth, the easiest thing you could do would be to pick up that socket and plug it back in, or the plug, and put it back into the EU single market. And you would have an economic boost that would be greater than just about anything they've proposed. And then if you want to do the kind of what they call supply side reforms on top of that, so much the better. But yeah, we're laboring under this kind of false economy here that there is an answer to prosperity that doesn't involve a hard conversation about trade and trade with the EU. And even Keir Starmer doesn't want to touch that, and I suspect won't touch it. Because to pick up on Elsa's point, that the Labour Party is not one big happy family. It's a bigger, happier family than it was under Jeremy Corbyn. But you had the same dynamic then, where you had Corbyn had the membership, but not the parliamentary party, and that caused all sorts of ructions. So, and I think that's not unique to British political parties either. It's harder to build a broad tent, again, in this kind of information environment where we can all kind of huddle together in our own little information corners, getting ginned up and riled up about issues that other people might not even know about. And I think it's easy to misread things. So yeah, I wish we could have a more rational conversation, a broader conversation. And that's something hopefully some political leaders will start thinking about. How do we do that? And soon, or else we won't be able to solve these big public policy problems that we have.
Ben, how about you on this issue of whether being PM in a post-Brexit world is harder?
Well, it's harder in one sense that you have lost something you can blame. Now, that didn't prevent Boris Johnson from blaming the EU for all kinds of things going wrong with the British economy, but it does become more challenging when the EU has less direct control over you than it did. And Dominic Cummings, his advisor, had thought this would be a great thing about Brexit, that finally we would be responsible for our own problems, and we have, it seems, created more problems to be responsible for. I think what I would say is that this conversation that we're having on Canadian TV is quite distinct in the way that we're talking about Brexit than one that would be appearing on The World at 1 or some other British show, Politics Live, because the very agreement that Brexit hasn't been good for the British economy there's still an omerta about saying that in British political life. Now, that omerta is ending slowly, but that is in part for the reasons that Elsa and Stephen have mentioned, because the Labour Party is also scared to talk about Brexit. And so nobody wants to bring this up. And I sincerely doubt that we will be able to talk about Brexit in a reasonable way until after the next general election.
Which is how long from now?
Well, 2 years is probably the realistic maximum, because it's a 5-year after December 2019, and nobody's really going to want to hold it in December of 2024.
Gotcha. Well, the UK Prime Minister is still, I think, considered one of the good political jobs to have in this world. And yet, when it came time to replace Liz Truss, there's one person who was on the list of potential candidates. There was no fight for the job. They gave it to Rishi Sunak. And I guess, Anoush, why don't you start us off on this round? Is he the right person for the job at this time?
Well, I think you're right. It shows the state of the Conservative Party at the moment, that there was really only one candidate that MPs could rally around. I mean, the two really who were up for it were Rishi Sunak, the guy who lost only in the summer, and Boris Johnson, the guy who was pushed out of his job after making a mess of doing it. So, it really, doesn't demonstrate great things about the health of the party. Rishi Sunak is seen by Tory MPs on the whole, although there are many internal critics who blame him for sort of stabbing Boris Johnson in the back, or all sorts of other things, not being conservative enough, for example. His response to the pandemic was seen as quite sort of big state thinking. So there are a lot of very traditional conservatives who didn't really like that. But on the whole, Tory MPs sort of agreed that he was the right person in terms of tone to suggest that he's a kind of, safe pair of hands, decent sort who will kind of bring the rabble together and, inject a little bit more professionalism into the politics. And you could see that from his first speech outside Downing Street, when he, his family weren't there. He didn't look triumphant. He refused to smile for the photographers. It was almost like he was coming in as a sort of new CEO into an ailing company to try and kind of manage it out of its doldrums. So I think he's trying to present himself as that kind of technocratic kind of leader. And I think maybe if I were a Tory MP, I'd think that's the kind of thing that we'd need at the moment as well. It's very similar to the pitch that Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, the main opposition, is trying to make to the country as well. I'm a sort of sensible type with integrity who can, have an adult approach to politics that we haven't seen beneath Liz Truss or, more significantly, Boris Johnson.
Ailsa, do you think Sunak is the right person for the job at this moment?
Well, I suppose it depends for whom. Are you thinking of the electorate? Are you thinking of his MPs, or even are you thinking of Conservative Party members? I think you get different answers on that. But if we're looking at the electorate, I think there's a certain number of things that we might be thinking of. One of them is whether his personal polling has narrowed the gap at all to Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, and also whether his polling on economic competence is making a difference. And it's clear from that perspective that he is. He's narrowed the gap with Starmer, but also his personal polling on perceived economic competence is faring up well. And we've also seen the Conservative Party narrowing that gap in terms of economic competence. Where we've yet to see an improvement is in whether people would vote for the Conservative Party, because even though he personally has good polling figures, and even though they're recovering ground on economic competence, it's not yet translating into vote intention for any future election, and that will worry people.
Andrew, what say you?
Yeah, I think that the challenge, I think in the immediate crisis, he's the right person because he understands the economics of what is and isn't possible right now. And kind of the Tory party's in that first do no more harm phase of things. And so he's right there. What remains to be seen is whether he can take that next step. Because if you think about it, who Sunak is as an individual represents kind of the kind of typical asset holding class that has done so well out of globalization. He's worth a fortune, both off his own back and through his marriage. And he sees the world kind of in that more global service-led economy. But he's now fronting Boris Johnson's 2019 manifesto, which was very much not that. It was a pledge to level up across the country, to redistribute, to make sure that more of that wealth in the Southeast gets out around the regions. And I'm not sure how intuitively he believes in that or understand it. And although he did go big state during the COVID response, that was because he had to, not because I think he wants to. And so I think, to get to that point of electorally in the future, can he be the man to take them there? I'm not sure, because he just doesn't live the life that most Britons. And I don't think, the mood of the moment now is very much left on economics, right on culture. And I don't think he's that. I think he's the inverse on that. And so we'll see if he can convince the electorate otherwise.
Well, we haven't mentioned it yet, but at the risk of stating the obvious, he is the first person of color in the history of the United Kingdom to become Prime Minister of the country. Ben, to you first on this. Do you have any sense about what British South Asians think about the fact that has happened?
Yeah, obviously, I don't want to speak for the whole community. There has been some excitement, and there were a bunch of Diwali celebrations the same day that Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, and people very excited. There was a poll conducted last summer by a number of US-based academics that surveyed Britons of Indian ethnicity about their preferences. And Rishi Sunak does have, or did have then, and I'm guessing still does have, fairly high sort of what we call feeling thermometer, so people's impression of how much they like him, and higher indeed than Keir Starmer. So even though Indian ethnicity Brits on average are slightly more likely to vote for Labour than the Conservatives, Rishi Sunak was preferred to Keir Starmer. And that wasn't just because Rishi Sunak was Indian, because they didn't much like Priti Patel, who was the Home Secretary at the time. There is something about Rishi Sunak that maybe is more reassuring to people in general, both of Indian and non-Indian descent. What is surprising is that there are big splits. Well, maybe it's not surprising. Indians are not a homogenous, monolithic community. So the Conservative Party are more popular, at least in this poll, among Hindu and Christian Indians, but much less popular among Muslims and Sikhs. So when we look at the way this is playing out among ethnic communities in Britain, I think we have to be careful to make sure that we're looking at people in the groups they define themselves as, not just saying, oh, the South Asian community like or don't like Rishi Sunak. They're quite varied in electoral terms in the UK.
Okay, let's change our focus here a little bit to Scottish independence. And Ailsa, maybe to you first on this. Given the chaotic nature of the United Kingdom lately, do you think that has encouraged a greater fervor for Scottish independence?
No, but only because I think the bounce in support occurred earlier. So we know that Brexit is responsible for some of the change that we see, although it's explained the volatility rather than the rise necessarily. So we know that after the Brexit result, that there were certain people who had voted no against independence, had switched their allegiance to yes. But we also know that there were some moving in the opposite direction. We know that the handling of the pandemic also could be attributed to, or could have led to a bounce in support, because we know that Scots had a greater sense of satisfaction or trust in the Scottish government than in the UK government. So there was an approval gap that already existed that widened over the course of COVID, the COVID handling. But the large reason for the jump was Boris Johnson. And we saw that coming during the leadership campaign in which he was running, and it manifested itself after he became leader. So what we're seeing now is not another jump. It's because the jump had already occurred under Boris Johnson. And the other thing to note is that with each change in the Conservative Party, we have seen no movement backwards in terms of that support for independence. And recent polling asks, how do you feel about independence? And then when they alter the question and they start mentioning specific possible Conservative prime ministers, support always goes up. So one thing we know is that it's the Conservative Party that's doing some of the movement, and having caused an increase in support for independence under Boris Johnson, we see no successive leader unpicking that situation, and it does not look like it's going to change anytime soon.
Understood. All right, let's talk some democratic legitimacy here. And just before asking this question, let's establish that everything that's transpired here is obviously legal. It's kosher. But the fact of the matter is Sunak didn't have a contest to become the prime minister, right? He was acclaimed. He was the only person going for the job. So not only have the British public not endorsed him as prime minister, but even members of the Conservative Party have not endorsed him as prime minister either. So maybe a mischievous question, but one I'll ask anyway. Andrew, does he have a legitimacy problem here?
I think he does, and I think it's not on the technical lines, as you said, but I do think that the majority of the electorate, the British people, look out and go, this isn't what I asked for. So I think that in itself is a legitimacy problem. And I think he probably does have the support of a majority of his parliamentary colleagues. So in the immediate bit, that's probably enough to get him by. And had he not kind of reverted in kind of language and tone back to the 2019 manifesto they were all elected on, I'd be a little bit more concerned. For example, Liz Truss completely changed the direction of travel with her tax cutting agenda, and that was certainly something nobody voted for. So I think she had an even bigger democratic legitimacy problem, despite being acclaimed by a bigger subset of people, i.e. the Conservative Party membership, which is only 170-odd thousand. So yeah, I do think that there are very real problems, and people are upset about that.
Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Andrew that the big legitimacy concern was Liz Truss ripping up the manifesto that the party had been elected on. And, if anything, the Tory membership are less representative of the country than Conservative MPs, which is saying something. I think that ultimately it will only matter to the degree that it will provide a line for the opposition for the next 2 years, because realistically, there's no way Conservative members of Parliament are going to vote under current polling to lose their seat. So I created a little online app you could use to re-simulate the 2019 general election under new polling. And when I put in the last set of numbers under Liz Truss and under Rishi Sunak, my app didn't work any longer because I hadn't got the scales correct for the number of seats they would have. Labour would have over 500 seats. So that means there's no way that if I were a Conservative MP, I would want to stand for election. And there's no way that Rishi Sunak will march his troops to death in that way. So it will give Keir Starmer a line in Prime Minister's questions, and it's a fair line. But ultimately, this is a parliamentary system. We vote for members of Parliament. They were all fairly elected. And so, as you say, it's formally legitimate. And there's no way that Rishi Sunak is going to want to test his broader public legitimacy anytime before the end of 2024.
Just out of curiosity, what's the app called in case our viewers want to play around with it?
Well, it's my GE19 re-simulator. So if you type in GE19 re-simulator, you might find a Twitter post about it.
Anoush, can I get you to weigh in on that issue of legitimacy?
Yes, so I totally agree with what the other panelists have said. I think there is a lack of legitimacy, obviously not in terms of how our system works. He is allowed to be prime minister without having a general election. But I was around the country out reporting when Liz Truss resigned, and the people I was speaking to were saying, bring on a general election, or even expected there to be one. And I think really that is where the public is at. And that's why Labour is using this line that, no one elected Rishi Sunak and there should be a general election in its attack lines, because it knows that there's an appetite for that in the country. So in terms of public opinion, yes, I think he's losing some support and attachment to what people want. But then also in terms of what he's about to introduce, we're getting all of these signals that they're about to cut back spending. Very difficult decisions have to be made, they keep saying. But actually, that's very different from the prospectus for the country that people voted for in 2019, which was this levelling up, which was mentioned earlier, which means rebalancing the economy with investment and big infrastructure projects that, Boris Johnson wanted to bring in around the country. And that meant, a big statism in Conservative Party terms. And if Rishi Sunak wants to introduce this sort of public spending retrenchment, that takes us very far from what people voted for. Okay, maybe not as radical as Liz Truss's tax-cutting agenda, but it's still very different and not what people voted for. So I think that's precisely where the legitimacy problem lies, and we'll see it, become more and more acute if they do bring in cuts in November when they're doing their next budget.
Ailsa, I wonder whether these questions of legitimacy, I wonder whether the post-Brexit issues, I wonder whether the revolving door around the Prime Minister's job, do you think it has all contributed to making Britain somehow lesser in the eyes of other countries around the world?
No, I think if there's it's a good question, but I would say if there is a change occurring, it is not that those outside the UK are changing their assessments of the UK. I think it is the penny dropping within the UK about what those external assessments have always been. And I think it's a reckoning there. There's always been a bit of a gap between how the UK perceives itself on an international stage and how it actually behaves. And so I think, if anything, if these recent events have had a change, it's not in how international leaders and different governments react to the United Kingdom. It's that the United Kingdom is slowly waking up to the fact that, or to the reality of what its international reputation is, and its market power as well. I mean, I think that's the change we're seeing.
Well, I guess India has now surpassed Britain as the 5th largest economy in the world. So, Ben, I wonder whether you think that, plus these other things we've discussed, has diminished Britain in the eyes of the rest of the world.
I mean, I think, the possibility that a country of just under 70 million people could ever remain larger economically than a country of over 1 billion. Now, that would be a really bad thing for the world if that were true, right? We want development in currently poorer countries. I think What I will say about Britain is there are two Britons in international perspective. There's one that believes a great deal in itself, much more than the rest of the world believes in it. That's the kind of puffed up, John Bull Britain that we've associated with Boris Johnson. But there's another Britain that's London, that is still unequivocally one of the world's great global cities. And, despite the chaos of the last few years, is still an attractive place for people to come, to move to set up businesses. Our universities are still attractive places for students to come. And so it's an odd parallel world, actually, in that there are many great things about Britain that our government doesn't like talking about, like our universities and our vibrant, diverse cities, while at the same time it wants to get excited about the parts of Britain that aren't succeeding and that don't look so great from an international perspective.
Andrew, we've all seen lots of elections, both here and where you are, where one party that was in power was 15, 20, 25 points behind. It seemed hopeless. But given a period of time and given changing circumstances, they managed to work their way back into the electorate's trust and won. Do you see conditions now that would permit, over the next couple of years, the Conservative Party to retain power the next time it has to go to the polls?
Well, Steve, I think one of the lessons from the last 2 months here has to be that the 2 years we have coming up are a long time, and that a lot can change. I just think a lot of it is out of the government's hands in terms of what happens to Vladimir Putin, what happens in Ukraine, what happens in global energy markets. And hopefully at some point the government will lean into the things that Ben talked about and realize that the future economy has to be built on brain power. Britain has lots of brain power. It has lots of cities and lots of talented people. And you have to make your strengths and then do some serious public policy to address the weaknesses, education and opportunity. And that comes, and that's a patient, decades-long, generations-long thing. And that's what worries me, is that the country's not having a serious conversation about that, whilst we obsess about relatively minor issues as to whether a former cabinet minister can go on a reality TV show, which was the topic of conversation this week, if you can believe it. So here's to hoping that we can have some more reality.
Anoush, last word to you. Is there enough time for the Tory party to turn it around?
I don't think there is, actually. I think Rishi Sunak will do a certain amount to try and rehabilitate its reputation. But, it's really swimming around in the bottom of the polls at the moment, and people just see it as not competent. And I think once you've lost that sheen, that competent edge, it's really hard to get it back. And so, the Labour Party does have a bit of a job on its hands still in trying to sort of demonstrate that it has a vision of its own for the country. But I really think that it will, what's the point of a Labour Party if it can't win next time?
All right. Ailsa Henderson, Ben Ansell, Andrew McDougall, Anoush Chakalian, it's really good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Many thanks for sharing your views.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Concern about inflation led to government efforts to control it, which in turn now has people worried about tipping our economy and others into recession. These are complicated times, but perhaps also an opportunity for those who see a path to reform the global economic order. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, professor at Columbia University, and the author most recently of People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. And Joseph Stiglitz joins us now from Manhattan Island in New York City, and it's great to have you back on our program. How are you doing, sir?
It's great to be here.
I wonder if I can start by taking you back to your days growing up in Gary, Indiana, in a steel town. And I wonder if you could characterize the kind of capitalism you grew up with back then with what we have today.
Well, it was supposed to be the golden age of capitalism. But when I was growing up, it didn't feel that way. What I saw was enormous levels of inequality, racial discrimination, labor market turbulence, economic fluctuations, recessions. So it didn't seem so golden.
It didn't seem so golden, but relatively speaking, in terms of income inequality and so on, was it better then than what we have now?
It was much better than it is now. Things, I don't think anybody envisioned how worse things would go in the last 40 years.
For example, corporate CEOs made on average what times the average industrial wage then compared to today?
I can't remember exact number, but it was like 30, 40. Now it's like 270, 300. It's been multiplied by a factor of 10. That's just one example. If you look at a chart showing what's happened to the top 1% over the last 40 years, they've done very, very well. But if you look at a chart which shows what's happened to the bottom 90%, not the bottom 10 or 20, but the bottom 90%, you need a microscope to see progress.
Okay, let me follow up on that. I can understand why it's been a beautiful thing for those in the top 1% to be making so much more money today than they did back when you were living in Gary, Indiana. Why is it bad for the rest of us?
Well, that stagnation has manifested itself in many ways. You know, life expectancy, which especially as you get older, you start focusing on those kinds of issues. Life expectancy has been in decline, and that was true even before the pandemic. There are many aspects of this kind of inequality. It's not only inequality in income, inequality in wealth is twice that of income, but an essential part of America has been the American dream, some notion of equality of opportunity. And strikingly, if you look at recent data, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced country.
I just heard you use the expression, the 1%. Am I right in saying that you coined that? You were the first guy to use that expression, were you not?
Well, it's not that unusual of an expression, so I don't want to say I should have a copyright. I think what I did was in my Vanity Fair paper and article in 2011, which was titled "Of the 1%, for the 1%, by the 1%." I think it gave resonance to this idea of the 1%.
Well, let's follow up on that then, because you do offer a new remedy in this new book of yours. You call it progressive capitalism. What does that entail?
Well, it entails the notion of progress, that we can advance. It entails the notion of capitalism, which means in a large modern economy, you can't have central planning, you can't have central control, you have to have some degree of decentralization. But I want to emphasize the other words in the title of my book, people. It's a kind of capitalism that puts people first, that says the economy is intended to serve the people rather than the people serve the economy. It recognizes unfettered capitalism can wind up with a concentration of power, and that power leads to profits, but those profits are not necessarily directed at enhancing societal well-being.
Some people have noted that the word capitalism is still in your prescription for what ails us, and they are intrigued by that because I guess they weren't sure that you were actually sold on capitalism. The fact that it's there, what do we infer from that?
Well, it's precisely the point I made. Markets are an important instrument for advancing well-being, but they have to be regulated. Every sport has to have rules and referees, and the market economy is a very rough sport, and you need to have rules and referees. For instance, you have to protect the environment, you have to protect workers, you have to protect consumers, and we see in the United States over and over again what happens when you don't have adequate protection. We have the opioid crisis, we have the childhood diabetes crisis, we have a problem of climate change, excess pollution. So what I'm calling for is, let's use the power of the market. Let's make sure that the power of the market is directed at enhancing societal well-being.
Well, the trick, of course, is to figure out how to get from here to there. What are your suggestions on that front? How do we build a more progressive capitalism?
Well, democracy is going to be an essential part of that. And that's why many of my ideas are related to what in Europe they call social democracy. I think if you ask most people, what do they want? What do they care about? They want education for their children. They want to make sure they have an adequate retirement. They want a job with dignity, with decent pay. They don't want monopolies taking advantage of them. They want to be able to be their environment to be protected. They want to be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water. So if you look then what people want, if we have a democracy that is actually working, it should deliver what people want. It should deliver the kind of economy that corresponds to what people want. And I believe progressive capitalism is exactly what people want.
A lot of this is marketing, of course. And by that, I mean, if you say socialism, a lot of people's noses get out of joint. If you say social democracy, it's a somewhat different thing. Can you help us understand the distinction between the two, if in fact there is one?
Well, 19th century and early 20th century socialism was about the ownership of the means of production. You think of the Soviet Union, the government had central planning, everything was run by the government. Progressive capitalism is very different from that. As I've said before, it's about enterprise, entrepreneurship, innovation, but it's about making sure that all these enterprises work within a set of rules that make sure that what they do advances broader interest. And by the way, I should also point out that an essential part of the idea of progressive capitalism is what I call a rich ecology of institutions, a wide variety of institutions. For instance, I teach at Columbia University. America is often recognized one of the strongest sets of institutions are our universities. And a very large fraction of those universities are neither state-owned, none of them are for-profit. And they are nonprofit institutions, they are foundations, and they play a very important role in our society. Cooperatives are also very important. People don't realize how important cooperatives are in America, but the only part of our financial institutions that function well in the years before and after the financial crisis were our financial cooperatives, which are called credit unions. So we actually have much more complex set of institutional arrangement than just for-profit firms and government. And all of these need to be part of what I call progressive capitalism.
Out of curiosity, would you say that China of today is a progressive capitalist society?
No. It's authoritarian. It doesn't have this kind of dynamic ecology of various institutions. It has resisted the creation of NGOs. In many ways, it's the antithesis of progressive capitalism.
Okay, in which case, if a skeptic were going to look at your book and come away saying, this guy simply wants too much regulation, too much of the rules of the game as he just described them, in order to create the kind of economy that would be progressively capitalistic for enough people, what would you counter with?
Well, I would first say that we've always had rules. We need to protect the environment. If we don't do that, we have no choice, but we have to live within our planetary boundaries. And if you don't squash monopolies, you won't wind up with a kind of innovation that's at the heart of a successful economy. The reason that we have higher standards of living today than we did 250 years ago is precisely the mix of private and public and NGO that I describe in progressive capitalism. It's because of innovation. And part of innovation, most important part, is basic research, which is financed by government. But so is the private sector important. And so it's really this whole pattern that I've described that has been at the core of the success that we've had over the last 250 years.
Well, let's look at some of the components of what this progressive capitalism might entail. For example, on tax policy, generally speaking, what would you want to do?
I want to have progressive taxation. I'd want the corporations to pay their fair share. There not to be all the tax evasion and avoidance that we see today. Basic principles of social justice would say that somebody who is a coupon clipper shouldn't pay lower taxes as a percentage of his income than somebody who works hard for a living. And this is not a revolutionary idea. Warren Buffett said it was unconscionable that he's paying a smaller percentage of his taxes than his secretary.
No, that's fair enough, but I do remember a couple of election campaigns ago in this country that the leader of the Social Democratic Party at the time said it gets confiscatory when personal income tax rates get up over 50%. Do you share his view?
The exact number is one that economists have debated. The most recent research in economics suggests that when you balance out the benefits of more egalitarian taxes with the cost of more progressive taxes, the view that is emerging within the economics profession is that taxes of 70% at the margin, at very top levels, are probably desirable. But that may depend on the precise circumstances of the country. These things are contingent on many different variables. I don't think there's anything magic about the number 50%. And as our societies change, the importance of public goods like research, education, health have increased, and that may necessitate increasing tax rates.
Okay, how about this? A couple of moments ago, you told us that you clearly did not think that China was an example of a progressive capitalistic country. Are there any countries around the world that you think are doing it the way you think it ought to be done?
Well, there's no one who exactly follows my prescription, but there are a number of countries that have adopted important parts of this. New Zealand, for instance, managed the COVID-19 extraordinarily well and has incorporated in their budgeting notions of well-being, concerns about deprivation. Norway and some of the other Scandinavian countries have adopted many of the precepts that I've advocated, very concerned about protecting the environment and investing in their people. And I think that's part of the reason that they've had success in their standards of living. It is very interesting studies that look at well-being, standards of income, however you measure it, show countries like Norway being really significantly higher than the United States.
Professor Stiglitz, in our last couple of minutes here, you know that the International Monetary Fund, in a recent forecast, says the worst is yet to come, and for many people, 2023 is going to feel like a recession. We got midterm elections coming up south of the border here in your country. The next Congress is going to be tasked with figuring out how to make sure that doesn't happen. What do they need to do?
Well, what worries me the most is that the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates too high and too fast, causing an unnecessarily deep and prolonged economic downturn. We don't know for sure because obviously they look at things month by month, but every indication is that is what they are going to do because of a misreading of the economic circumstances. The inflation we have today is by and large caused by supply side disturbances, not an excess of aggregate demand. And you're not going to get more oil, more food. You're not going to solve the chips problem, the automobile industry, by raising interest rates. But what you can do by raising interest rates is cause a severe economic slowdown. And so, when you're a central banker, raising interest rates is the tool you have. There's the old joke about if you're a carpenter, that you have a hammer and everything you do is with the hammer. And I'm afraid central banks are the same way. The danger is that they are even counterproductive, because what we need to alleviate these supply side constraints is more investment, and higher interest rates make that more difficult.
We are happy to remind people of your latest contribution on these and other issues: people, power, and profits, progressive capitalism for an age of discontent. And we're delighted that it's brought Professor Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University to our program tonight. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka checks in on the emergency in Ontario's emergency rooms and hospital capacity. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.